Okay, so I thought maybe I would make one video as a response to a number of emails about, study tips for this unit too. Um, a lot of this I've said here and there. I thought maybe I could kind of put it all into one place and give you guys sort of a barrage of tips and ideas and strategies that you can use as you're preparing for our unit, the Spring 2020 BIOL 110 Cardiovascular and Respiratory Unit. First chapter, chapter 20 is blood. We haven't done it yet. We're going to wrap up blood on Thursday. It's going to be a small part of the chapter. I'm going to tell you the things you need to know. Chapter 21 is the heart. Heart is a big part of this chapter. You already know this, but my goodness sakes, if there's an organ that all healthcare providers of every discipline and every role in the healthcare team should know a chunk about, it's definitely the heart. And when it comes to the heart, I think the objectives are pretty clear. But like I said today, being able to trace the path of a red blood cell through the heart, starting in any part of the cardiovascular system, it doesn't matter which, is important. And that's the thing where you say, starting in the right atrium. And then from there, to be able to refer to all of the important and named structures from our list. Start in the right atrium, going past the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, past the pulmonic semilunar valve, out the pulmonary trunk, into the pulmonary arteries, into the lungs. This pulmonary arteries become this capillary bed that surrounds the alveoli. There's a gas exchange that occurs in the capillary bed. Pulmonary veins come together to form larger and larger pulmonary veins until ultimately 4 pulmonary veins lead back into the left atrium. Blood in the left atrium is ejected out through the bicuspid valve, left AV valve, into the left ventricle, past the aortic valve, into the aorta, out into the systemic circuit, yada, 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 capillary bed. Other side of the capillary bed, bigger and bigger and bigger veins, ultimately dumping into either the superior or inferior vena cava, depending on the path that red blood cell took, and then back into the right atrium. I could ask you a bunch of questions about that path. I could ask you, I'm floating in the such and such a chamber, what valve do I go to next? What chamber do I go to next? I'm floating in the SVC, what chamber do I go to next? I can say I'm floating in the IVC, what valve do I cross next? Floating in the IVC, the next valve you're going to cross, take a minute and think about it. It's the tricuspid valve, it's the right AV valve. There's no valve between the SVC and the right atrium, okay? Understanding the coronary circulation, the right and the left coronary arteries and the branches on our list. There's a right coronary artery and a circumflex, and it terminates as the posterior interventricular artery. There's a left coronary artery that almost immediately gives off an anterior interventricular branch, and then the vessel continues and swings around as the left circumflex and ends in a posterior ventricular branch off the left coronary. In general, the left heart, venous blood is drained by a great cardiac vein. In general, the right heart, venous blood is drained by a small cardiac vein. Those converge along with others and form a common coronary sinus that dumps venous blood from the heart itself back into the right atrium. So that's the coronary circulation. Then there's the systemic circulation, artery and veins. Arteries, there's all the branches off the aortic arch, brachiocephalic, left common carotid, left subclavian. Brachiocephalic becomes the right common carotid and the right subclavian. The common carotids become the internal and external carotids. External, of course, serving everything in the head and neck, exterior or outside the skull, and the internal carotids supplying the structures inside the skull, in particular the brain. As well as the vertebral artery that travels up posteriorly through this transverse foramen and enter the end of the posterior skull and supply the posterior brain. And there's an interconnectedness between those two sources of arterial blood, and Maybe I'll make a separate video about that, since it's going to be extra credit for this exam. Veins that drain structures internal to the skull lead back to the internal jugular vein. Veins that drain the exterior structures outside of the skull drain to this vein known as the external jugular vein. I think I said that right. Those vessels, the internal jugular vein, unite with the venous drainage of the upper extremity, the subclavian veins, and those two structures on each side form a common brachiocephalic vein on the left and on the right. Those two things unite or converge and form the superior vena cava that dumps back into the right atrium. From the subclavian onward, subclavian axillary artery, brachial artery. Brachial artery bifurcates into a medial ulnar artery and a lateral radial artery. These contribute to two palmar arches, a superficial and a deep palmar arch, which from there send out a pair of digital arteries to each finger. At capillary beds, those red blood cells come back into the venous. On the other side, they enter the venous circulation, which is ultimately going to return to the heart. And there are deep veins of the upper extremity that run alongside with and mirror and share names with those arteries: ulnar artery, radial artery, brachial artery, axillary artery, subclavian artery. Remember, subclavian IJ join to form a brachiocephalic vein. Did I say artery? I think I said artery just now. Ulnar vein, radial vein, brachial vein, axillary vein, subclavian vein. Sorry if I said that backwards. The aorta ascends, gives off the arch vessels, and descends the posterior thorax through the diaphragm into the abdomen. In the pelvis, it splits to the common right and left common iliac arteries. Those two things split as well. It gives an internal branch that goes into the pelvis and an external iliac artery that continues on down towards the legs. When that artery dives under the inguinal ligament, it changes names. Once it's past the distal of the inguinal ligament, it's now known as the femoral artery. The femoral artery continues down the femoral region of the thigh, posterior to the knee, trifurcates. Behind the knee, it's known as the popliteal artery for a short distance, and it trifurcates. Anterior tibial, posterior tibial, fibular. Interior tibial comes down anteriorly. When it crosses the tarsal region, it becomes known as the dorsalis pedis artery. You can feel a pulse. Posterior tibial artery travels obviously posteriorly. It sort of drifts medially, and it passes behind the medial malleolus, the inner bump of the ankle. There's a pulse back there. And those as well continue down to the foot, form arches and branches out to the toes, digital arteries. There are deep veins that come back and mirror those veins I just said: posterior tibial vein, interior tibial vein, popliteal vein, femoral vein, external iliac vein, internal iliac vein. Common iliac veins form together the inferior-most portion of the inferior vena cava, the IVC that we learned about. IVC comes up and dumps all that blood into the right atrium. There are superficial veins in the upper and lower extremities. The superficial veins of the upper extremity are the medial basilic vein, the lateral cephalic vein. These join in with the deep system, proximal to the shoulder. Lower extremity superficial veins are the medial great cephalic vein, or greater cephalic, the medial great saphenous vein and the lateral lesser saphenous vein. Greater saphenous vein is on the side of the big toe, the medial side of the leg, and the lesser saphenous vein is on the lateral side of the leg, the pinky toe, the lesser, the small side of the leg. You know what I mean? The side of the small toe, the lateral side. That's the small saphenous vein, or the lesser saphenous vein. Those also join up with the deep system. In the abdomen, before the aorta bifurcates, it gives off a number of branches. It gives off some paired branches to the kidneys. That's the right and left renal arteries. It gives off branches to the gonads. That's the right and left testicular, the right and left ovarian arteries. As well, it gives off single or unpaired branches. Celiac, trunk, left gastric, splenic, common hepatic. Then the abdominal aorta gives off the superior mesenteric artery, And finally, it gives off the inferior mesenteric artery. There are also veins that drain those territories: superior mesenteric vein, inferior mesenteric vein, splenic vein. Those things converge and blend together to form a large portal vein that brings all that blood to the liver. We're going to talk about that in the digestive unit. Don't forget to go back and review that section of the lecture videos where I talk about the arteries and veins in general, and talk about the tunics or the layers, the adventitia, the media, the intima, the levels, size of the vessels. I spent a few minutes talking about those. Probably ask you a question about the lower extremity valves and the lower extremity veins, what their purpose is, their function, how they're structured, as a one-way valves contribute to that function. Respiratory system. We talked about all the upper respiratory system, all of those named structures, being able to point out to them, being able to point them out on diagrams. We talked about the 3 paired and 3 unpaired laryngeal cartilages. We talked about the trachea and how it bifurcates into 2 primary or main bronchi, how those each branch again to form 3 secondary or lobar bronchi on the right, 2 on the left. How each of those branch further to form tertiary, aka segmental bronchi, and the segmental bronchi continue on and branch further to form respiratory and terminal bronchioles that ultimately open up into alveolar sacs of individual alveoli. There, each alveolus is surrounded by a sweater, a capillary bed that allows gas exchange. Understanding how simple squamous epithelium plays into those capillary beds and the alveolar sacs is very important. Type 1 and type 2 alveolar cells, alveolar macrophages, how those all play into the structures down there in the microscopic level. Those things are important. The serous linings of the lungs, the pleura, pleural cavity, and the muscles of respiration that we talked about, the diaphragm, the external and internal intercostal muscles. I'm not going to test you on the physiology of breathing. I'm not going to test you on all those x-rays we looked at. Those are just for fun. Okay, so those are the important points. Any of the structures we mentioned, any of the structures on that master list under the lab folder, I could point you on these models and ask you to identify. For the lecture side of things, any of those topics and concepts that I just briefly went through, they're questions. What are the questions like? The answer to that really lies in the Blackboard quiz and the in-class quizzes that I've given you. I can't give you every possible example of every exam question, but like an example we've talked about. Which of the following is considered a deep vein of the lower extremity? A, popliteal, B, femoral, C, posterior tibial, D, anterior tibial, E, great saphenous. Which of the following is not a branch of the celiac trunk? Which of the following is or is not a branch of the aortic arch? Which of the following carries oxygenated blood to structures inside the skull, such as the brain? What are the 2 named arteries that emerge from the common iliac artery? Internal iliac, external iliac. What's the structure of the landmark that marks the name chain from external iliac artery to femoral artery? Inguinal ligament. How many lobar bronchi exist on the right side? A1, B2, 3, C3, 4, D4, E5. The left main stem bronchus gives rise to which of the following? And the answer would be the superior and inferior lobar bronchi. and the possibilities are pretty numerous. And part of the point of the assignment of writing test questions, and part of the reason I've recommended that you guys study by quizzing each other and quizzing yourselves, is to prepare yourself for those things. Staring at the slides, not the best way to study. It works for some people, but not most. Not the best way to study. Flashcards for this work okay, but blank diagrams is probably really where the money is for the valves and the chambers and the arteries and veins and the bronchi and the lobes, all the structures of the upper respiratory system, all the laryngeal cartilages. Drawing those things out yourselves. I have YouTube videos where I draw out the arteries on a big blank piece of paper. That is really probably where the money is going to be for this. For the next unit, flashcards might be a bit more useful. I'm not sure. Going through the quizzes and substituting the specific structures I'm asking. How would I make the correct answer D instead of E? How would I ask this question to make aortic semilunar valve the answer? Oh, don't forget the conducting system of the heart. I've got a quiz question about the conducting system of the heart. I need you to understand how that system fires in order. So I'm hopeful that most of you have already started a lot of this, and then on Thursday and over the weekend we'll be able to put the finishing touches on everything. If you haven't started yet, reach out to me and help me figure out where you're at so far, so that we can make a kind of an itemized plan for Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and then we got our test on Tuesday. Okay, email me with questions. You guys are going to be all right.